In this lesson for statistics using Excel, we're going to focus on measures of variability, which include the range, the IQR, the sample standard deviation, the population standard deviation, and also the sample variance. And we want to talk a little bit about the difference between the sample standard deviation versus the population standard deviation. So I'm going to start off by using the data analysis ToolPak because that'll generate some of these values. It won't give us everything, but it will generate some of those values for us. So across the menu bar, we're going to go over to the data area. And then on the far right, once you're in the data area, there's the data analysis ToolPak right there. You'll click on that and open that up. And again, we're going to simply choose descriptive statistics. We'll say OK once we have that highlighted. It's going to ask us for the range of cells. So I'll go ahead and choose the range of cells. I'm doing this one right here with the variable length in there. And I'm choosing the variable name along with the measurements of that variable down below, and then we'll hit enter. Our data is grouped in a column, so we want to make sure that that's highlighted. And then we have a label in the first row. That the word length is not part of the data set. That is the variable of the data set, and then the measurements for that variable are down below. So we need to make sure we check that if we included the word length in there. I'm going to give it an output range just like I've done before. So I'll go ahead and select that. And I'm going to choose my output range over here. And I'm just going to choose 2 columns and make it kind of long. And then I want the summary statistics. And then I'll say OK. And this will take just a minute, and then it'll generate the summary statistics for the variable length. And so when we look through this list of summary statistics, we're going to be talking about the standard deviation and the variance, specifically the sample variance. We'll also talk about the range, which is the difference between the maximum and the minimum value, and then also the interquartile range, which isn't given in here. So we may have to write a function in order to generate the interquartile range. So if you recall, starting off with the range measures the difference between the maximum and the minimum value, and that's automatically generated on this output from the data analysis ToolPak. Otherwise, we could simply subtract 22.6 from 8.9. Now, if this was this data we had was arranged in order already, you could just write a function and say, well, this is equal to A14 minus A2, and then you could hit enter, and that'll calculate that range of 13.7. Another way that we could have done this is we could have used the functions for finding the minimum and the maximum value and then subtracted those two as well. The IQR, notice it doesn't give an IQR, and as far as I know, under the formulas, there's not an IQR function. The interquartile range measures the difference between the two quartiles, the first quartile and the third quartile. In other words, it's measuring how spread out the middle 50% of the data is. So we're going to have to calculate the first quartile and the third quartile in order to do that. And I'm going to use a formula in order to do that. So I'm going to start off with the equal sign. And then I'm going to go over to the formulas right here. And I'll go down to the pull down and choose more functions. And then I'm going to go through and I'm going to find the quartile exclusive, which we saw in the previous video. We'll select our array of data, which is A2 through A14. And then the quartile I want, since it's the third quartile minus the first quartile, I'm going to have to do Q3 for the third quartile. And you notice it automatically put that in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click in the cell and I want to add to that. I'm going to say I'm going to subtract from that. And then I'm going to go back in. And actually, we don't even have to go back in. We could start typing the word quartile. All right, so you can see I just typed that in the formula area right there. I have to select the array again, and then that's going to be followed by a comma, and then I'm going to put the number 1 after that because I want the first quartile or the 25th percentile. So up here in the formula area, it's showing you the function. Notice it's in capital letters right here when I pull it from the formulas that are generated, but it doesn't really matter. It'll recognize which one we're trying to do right there, and then we'll just hit enter. And that'll generate that interquartile range. If you recall, the interquartile range, the first quartile was somewhere in between those two. It was 10.85 technically. And then the third quartile would be the average of these two, which is 14.9. and if we subtract those, it's going to be 4.05 is the difference between those. So you can manually calculate the quartiles and then do another function to do it, or you can build a new function by combining things together like I did up here. All right, now I'm going to change gears. Remember actually, before I change gears, the range is how spread out the data is overall from the smallest to largest value, and the IQR is how spread out the data is in terms of the middle 50% of the data. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in class. So right now we're just getting at the calculations. We're going to change gears and we're going to talk about the standard deviation. There are two standard deviations that you're going to see. One is the sample standard deviation. The other is the population standard deviation. And students, I find, often get these mixed up. Whenever we have a data set, unless it explicitly states that that's population data, we're going to assume that the data set is a sample. So we want to calculate the sample standard deviation. Now, if it says, hey, this is population data, we want to calculate the population standard deviation, then obviously you're going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to use the functions in Excel in order to generate the sample standard deviation. So you see this, it's going to be the same value that's given to us in the output from the data analysis ToolPak, which you can see right here, which is highlighted. So in the formulas area, I'll go to the arrow below AutoSum to pull up the other options that I have. I'll go to more functions, and then I'm going to scroll through until I find the standard deviation. And you can see it's labeled as stdev.p, and the .p stands for population, and the stdev.s, which is the sample. We're going to be doing the sample standard deviation, so we want to choose this option first. We'll say OK. It'll ask us for our array of numbers, and I'm just going to highlight the values of the data that I have, cells A2 through A14. Number 2, this is something that's optional, and we're not going to get into this right now, but you're going to leave that blank, and then you're going to simply click OK, and that'll generate your sample standard deviation. And you can see this value that we just generated is the same as what the data analysis ToolPak generates as well. The population standard deviation you're going to see, however, is a little bit different. So we're going to change gears and take a look at that. So again, if we go into the formulas and go to the pull down arrow below AutoSum and choose more functions, we can scroll through the list and we can find the standard deviation .p for population. We'll select that, and then we're going to choose our range of cells. Sometimes it automatically wants to choose the range of cells. Notice it says D2 through D4 right now. It's choosing D2, which is this 13.7, through D4, which is the standard deviation. We don't want that, so you have to be careful when it automatically chooses the cells for you. If it's highlighted like it is right here in the function arguments, all you have to do is click in the cell that you want to start with and then drag that down to the cell that you want to end with, and it'll overwrite what's in there. So always double check that. This is cell A2 through A14, and that's what I have in there. We'll go ahead and hit enter. Again, we don't need this number 2 right here, but we'll say OK after this. And this is going to generate the population standard deviation. Really, the difference between the two is when we calculate the numerator for the sample standard deviation, we're dividing by the degrees of freedom, n-1, versus the population standard deviation, we're dividing by n, the number of items in the population versus the degrees of freedom. So the population standard deviation will always be smaller than the sample standard deviation. In general, unless it explicitly states it, we are going to be calculating the sample standard deviation in this class. The sample variance, it actually already calculated this, and the relation between the variance and the standard deviation is if we take this standard deviation and we square this value, 3.624, that's going to give us our variance, which is about 13.13397. Or we can use the formula to do that. And if we have the variance, if we take the square root of the variance, that's going to be our sample standard deviation. So let's go ahead and use a formula to do that. Again, we're in the formulas area. We're going to click the arrow down below the AutoSum, and then we'll go to more functions, and we're going to scroll down to the V's for variance. And it's just labeled VAR for variance, and then it has a .s. We want the variance of the sample. I'm not going to do anything with the variance of the population. We'll go ahead and choose that. Again, we need to select our array of values. If you didn't want to go out and select those by dragging and dropping, you can technically highlight this and type over the top of it, I know that I'm going to use cells A2, and then I have to separate that with a colon, and then say A14. Those are the cells that I want. And you'll notice over to the side, it brings up the values in those cells. So you can always look at that and do it that way without going through and dragging and selecting it, okay? So once we have that, we're not going to do anything with number 2, and we're just going to say okay. And then you're going to see that that generates our sample variance right there, which is the same as the sample variance that's given down there. So now we know how to calculate those measures of variability. In class, we'll talk about really what they are and get into a little bit more detail, but this at least gets you started and helps you out with the assignment and some of the content.